Good afternoon to all those who did not take the Schlafstunde. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here. I have to say, I'm going to lead your next panel, but I have to say, even though this is a subject that I have known for years, in the 1.5 days since we have started, I've really learned a lot, and I'm really grateful both to the Tel Aviv University and Dr. Stauber and the Claims Conference for having organized such a really well thought and well planned conference. Luxembourg agreements signed in September 1965 are no doubt one of the most significant chapters in the history of Israel and that of the Jewish world. For Israel, a young country barely 4 years old, they had an enormous impact in every possible field, economic, diplomatic, and even legal. For the Jewish world, the newly created voluntary organization, the Conference of Material Claims Against Germany, it achieved not only international unprecedented recognition and status, but since then, and as we have heard for many years now, it has continued to negotiate with the German government on behalf of Holocaust survivors. It has gotten increased funds which have seriously helped the most needy survivors. For Israel, a young country that had doubled its population in 1 year and had neither the infrastructure nor the financial means to absorb over 1 million refugees, the agreement literally saved it from collapse. Yesterday, we heard extensive presentations on the moral dilemma that Israel had to face, a dilemma which divided the society and the political class. The difficult choice the leaders of the country, David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharet, had to make between the deep reluctance to have any dealings with a country responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews, the very heavy emotional burden, the total voluntary boycott imposed on anything German, and on the other hand, the vital, the urgent, the existential need for funds of a young and beleaguered country that simply needed to survive and feed its citizens. Israel's difficult decision to negotiate was made possible not only after the German expression of responsibility and its acknowledgement of the unspeakable suffering it had caused to the Jewish people. And yet, notwithstanding that expression, the opposition of the Israeli population to any German money, and as a child I do remember this demonstration where we used to hear, "Money cannot buy our blood." All this was very widespread, and we even heard yesterday how violent it got. One should also mention that in Germany, too, these negotiations raised very strong opposition, both of the public and of leading politicians. And it took the immense courage and determination of leaders like the Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and the then Minister of Defense Franz Josef Strauss to overcome the strong opposition within the ranks of the government. And yet, for Germany too, this agreement was beneficial. It was the one deed that paved the road to rehabilitation and to acceptance of the new Germany in the family of nations. Today, in this session, the members of our panel will discuss the aftermath of these agreements. In hindsight, the consequences for each one of the three partners are known. For Israel, it literally saved the country from collapse. Also, this agreement created a precedent in international law, since this was the first time that a collective agreement was signed with a country that had not existed during the war. For the Holocaust survivors, it was the beginning of a very long and difficult road of recognition of their sufferings and of some of the modest compensations that they got. So we will now try to assess what happened after the storm. How did the gradual change in atmosphere, which finally led to mutual recognition and gradual reconciliation, how did all of this occur? we will try to understand who led these trends, who were the actors. We heard this morning about the role of the Israel Purchasing Mission, the common work even of sailors, the arrival of the first ships built by the Germans, but there were other, less obvious actors. So who were these actors? How did they act? And also, how did these agreements affect some of the survivors and the descendants of these survivors in next generations? If politicians played a leading role in both camps, the supporters and the oppositions to the agreements, leading intellectuals, writers, and poets had an impact on the public opinion too. So our first speaker on this panel will be Dr. Tzachi Cohen. Dr. Tzachi Cohen is the head of the Jewish Studies Master's Program at the Ono Academic College and former head of the School of Jewish Studies at the same college. Dr. Cohen's main fields of research are rabbinic and Hebrew literature, cinema, and culture. His recent books include What Does Cinema Resemble? Cultural and Thematic Readings of Modern Cinema, and another book, Recite Your Verse to Me, Stories of the Babylonian Talmud, Type, Context, and Meaning. Dr. Cohen will speak about one of our most leading intellectuals in the 50s and in the 60s, the poet, publicist, playwright Natan Alterman, whose weekly column, Hatur HaShvi'i, the seventh column, appeared for 24 years in the Davar paper. Now, in those years, the papers were actually the spokes voice of the political parties. Davar was the leading spokesperson for the Mapai that was in power. And so for 24 years, that column, the Tur HaShvi'i, was not only widely read, but had an impact and an influence. Alterman was a strong supporter of Ben-Gurion, but on the issue of reparations, they had differences, and this is what we will hear, I hope, from Dr. Cohen. Bevakasha.
Good afternoon. It's widely accepted that one should not start his paper with apologies. So not apologizing, just acknowledging that firstly I'm a stranger to these strange lands of historians. I'm not an historian. So I'll try to adjust this paper to the way historians think. And secondly, I'm not talking about the aftermath, but about the intellectual breakthrough that allowed the aftermath, the acceptance of the agreements. So it's widely known that the starting point of Israel-Germany relationships was very tense, naturally, and as demonstrated here, this is an Israeli passport stamped to all countries except Germany, indicating the public view of Germany as something outside culture, outside legitimacy that Israelis and Jews in general cannot forgive and cannot forget and cannot visit. Famously, as mentioned before, there was a public debate about the agreements. And this debate was not only political, it stretched into national fields, including culture. Alterman, in the early 50s, what was at his height as a poet. He has just published 3 very dominant poetry books, establishing his stand as a very dominant poet. And also, as just mentioned, he had a weekly column, the 7th column, published in the Var newspaper, and in which he addressed both major subjects in the public domain, and also some minor subjects, but always trying to come to some kind of conclusion, some kind of cultural conclusion or general historical conclusion from these events. And his column was very anticipated and seen as the sort of moral horn of the government. And even more, Alterman was viewed as someone who supplied the language, supplied the thinking tools for dealing with historical events throughout the late 40s and early 50s. And as a poet, Alterman himself tried to maintain a great distinction between his poetry and his public writing. Not always successfully. Later in his career, the two areas merged. But as a poet, Alterman had a very interesting viewpoint or way to experience the world and talk about it. Just a few verses from one of his very famous poems. The opening to his groundbreaking, thunderbolting first publication, Kochavim Bachutz, the stars are outside. So just a few lines. Still returns the tune you abandoned in vain, and the road's eyes are still open wide, and the cloud in its skies and a tree in its rain are waiting for you to renew old time's stride. So the poetical viewpoint, the poetical character is one of a minstrel, of a traveling poet that walks through the world with eyes wide open and an open heart that is overly excited from every encounter, from a drop of rain, from a stone on the road, from a new building being erected. Everything is very exciting. Everything is eye-opening. Everything is hyper viewed and hyper experienced. And this is the viewpoint of the poet. And as I said before, in his weekly column, some of this atmosphere can also be found in a very famous poem from April 1951. Alterman goes on and on about a beetroot, oversized beetroot that grew in one of the kibbutzim, and he sees it as a symbol of the renewal of Israel, of the Jewish people, and he goes on and on about it very excitedly. So it is widely accepted that Alterman's poetical viewpoint as a poet, but also as a public speaker, is one of someone who both expresses himself through emotion, but also experiences reality in a very emotional way. During the public debate on the agreements, Alterman, it's famously that although Alterman was a very loud and clear supporter of Ben-Gurion, usually his support of the Shilumim, of the agreements, was hesitant. While writing both in prose and in poetry for the agreements, he was somewhat reluctant towards them. But finally, he was for them, and he publishes a few poems. Two of the very famous ones are titled Three Things Regarding the Claims Towards Germany and After the Agreement Signing. dated from September 1952, and also a piece of prose, a very famous piece of prose, the Shilumim and the Demagogy, in which he takes apart the standpoint of political fraction Mapam. Years later, when Ben-Gurion famously encounters Adenauer in a meeting that was described in newspapers as an historical meeting, Alterman publishes another piece of prose in which he strongly opposes and criticizes Ben-Gurion both for meeting Adenauer and for viewing this meeting as some kind of forgiveness. So, what's Alterman's standpoint? Is he for the agreements or against the agreements? Is he for Ben-Gurion and against Ben-Gurion? This is a conundrum. Many have written about it. I would like to revisit the poems that Alterman published in 1952 and show that as early as 1952, Alterman suggests a standpoint a little bit more sophisticated than usually viewed, which later allowed public opinion to somehow accept the agreements. So going back to the poem Three Things Regarding the Claim, published in March 1951, actually. The poem has three parts. I won't read the entire poem, but I'll just tell you that he has three major parts. First, he attacks the word, the actual word, the wording, the naming of the agreements as Shilumim. Shilumim, we don't exactly know who came up with the actual name and why, but we do know. Okay, fine. I don't know. You know. But I believe that it comes from the biblical verse, Li nakam v'shilem, that has some kind of vengeance hinted in it. But I think that Alterman was strongly against the word, the very word, because of the indication of shalom, of some kind of peacemaking, which he couldn't accept. So that's the first part of the poem. The second part of the poem says that if we accept the money, we're going to accept it as repaying of theft, but not as some kind of paying for the bloodshed, some kind of being able to cover the blood by money or something like that. And the final part of the poem is addressed to the politicians, to the decision makers, strengthening their standpoint and calling them to hide their feelings in order to place a shield in the state of Israel's hands, being the rightful heiress of the murdered Jewish people. So looking at the poem, we have one part that addresses language, another part that deals with, morally deals with the dilemma, and then we have a final chapter that addresses the politics of the agreements. And the first two are somewhat disconnected with the conclusion. The morals and the poetics, the reading of the language, don't lead to the conclusion, to the political conclusion. The same goes for the second poem, after the agreement signing. Again, the poem starts with analyzing public reaction, public speech, other poets reacting to the agreements. And Alterman points that they chose one of two reactions, either complete silence or loud and violent reprisal. Then Alterman goes to very biblical styled part where he describes how the state of Israel is reclaiming stolen money from the killer's actual hands as rightful inheritance. And then, finally, from a historical viewpoint, from retrospect, Alterman writes that one day, if one day the money that originated from Germany will be used to somehow save the state of Israel, then this would be a rightful or a correct way to use the money, because the state of Israel is what gives meaning to the sacrifice of the Jewish people. So again, we have three parts. One, looking at language and art. One, addressing moral issues. And a political conclusion that does not directly derive from the first two parts. So, what's Alterman's viewpoint? Going back to Alterman the poet, I think viewing Alterman as a wide-eyed minstrel, admiring everything he meets in the world, is not the exact way to read his poetry. Alterman actually, both in form and in content of his poetry, is very level-headed, even technical, and very logical. But from this standpoint of being very logical, he allows himself sometimes in extreme encounters to let go and be very emotional. So Alterman actually composes a standpoint in which there are two levels of personality portrayed in poetry. On one level, maybe the more deeper level, surprisingly, the world should be considered logically and politically and coolly. But once encountering extreme circumstances, even the most logical person should be able to let go and express himself emotionally. But the two should stay detached, should stay as two different viewpoints. And maybe that's what Alterman tried to convey in his poetry, written in reaction to the agreements. And possibly this is an option for some kind of reconciling, because maybe the readers of Davar were able to understand, to conclude from Alterman poets, that although emotionally feeling the great difficulty addressing the agreements, when logic is applied, then maybe logic should take over here. So one can maintain an emotional standpoint that rejects the agreements, but still be for the agreements for logical reasons. And maybe this is the beginning of the acceptance of these agreements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen. I think you brought to us the complexity of what a poet has to deal with and his reactions. But I think we have to remember that Alterman became an icon in the Israeli public. He had a tremendous influence. And finally, it was also the publicist that continued to work. And that here in the end, I think that he did pave the way to the acceptance of those agreements.